So good afternoon and welcome. I'm Courtney from the Wayland Public Library, and today I have the privilege of introducing Alex Zamalin, author of Against Civility, The Hidden Racism in Our Obsession with Civility. Professor Zamalin is the director of the African American Studies program and assistant professor of political science at the University of Detroit Mercy. His areas of expertise include African American political thought, American politics, and political theory. He's the author of several books, including African American Political Thought and American Culture, The Nation's Struggle for Racial Justice, Struggle on Their Minds, The Political Thought of African American Resistance, Anti-Racism and an Introduction, and Black Utopia, The History of an Idea from Black Nationalism to Afrofuturism. In addition, Professor Zamalin's essays and reviews have appeared in various edited book collections and in peer-reviewed journals such as New Political Science, Contemporary Political Theory, and Women's Studies Quarterly. Thank you so much to Professor Zamalin for joining us this afternoon. I just have a couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. The first is that this program is being recorded for broadcast on Wayland's cable access station. It will also be made accessible on YouTube. Professor Zamalin will start with giving us an overview of his book. Then I have a few questions for him, and then we'll have some time for your questions. So please enter your questions at any time using the Q&A feature on Zoom. And finally, this event is made possible with the support of the Friends of the Wayland Public Library and by a grant from the Wayland Cultural Council, a local agency which is supported by the Mass Cultural Council, a state agency, in support of our Wayland Reads 2021 series, and we are grateful for their support. So now, without further ado, I will hand it over to Professor Zamalin.
Thank you, Courtney. Thank you, everyone, for coming to hear this conversation and for being here on a Sunday afternoon. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the motivation for writing this book and what I was trying to achieve, as well as the various arguments that I make throughout it. So in 2018, in fall of that year, as the midterm elections were heating up and as there was a lot of debate about what the Democratic Party would do to challenge and oust Donald Trump and Republicans from office, the idea of civility was a recurrent theme. Civility, as many in the mainstream understood it, was something that all of us should aspire to. Civility means a spirit of reconciliation, bipartisanship, a desire to be polite and respectful, tolerant of the opposing view. And this became something that was almost a certain kind of common sense. Few people would deny the value of civility, at least so it seemed. As someone who's trained in African American intellectual history and political theory, I was immediately struck by the way that the Democratic Party, the party that espouses or claims to espouse commitments to racial justice and equality, was very quick to embrace civility. The reason why I was puzzled by it was precisely because I knew on an intuitive level that civility had been used to silence democratic movements, and civility had historically been weaponized by reactionary and conservative forces in a successful and effective way to destroy anti-racist struggle. But it was only when I started to do the research for the book, when I started to actually get into the history, that it became clear that my intuitions were not only right, but misguided on some level. It wasn't simply that civility had been weaponized by conservative forces to suppress racial justice movements, but that historically it has been used consistently for the purpose of violence, repression, excessive domination, and so on. So what puzzled me was, why then, given this history, starting with 1837, the first time that civility is invoked in the national public sphere, is the slave defender, the defender of slaveholding, John C. Calhoun, who was former vice president under Andrew Jackson and is the distinguished senator from South Carolina. John C. Calhoun takes the Senate stage in 1837 and says the greatest threat to our nation is not the enslavement of 3 million people. It is the abolitionists in New England who are rising in number, 300,000 strong. That is William Lloyd Garrison's anti-slavery society, non-resistance society. Calhoun says this is the problem. This is the greatest threat to our union. These abolitionists are uncivil. And it's not simply Calhoun. It is virtually every single defender of the status quo in the 19th century who wants to use civility for the purpose of silencing, repressing, and dominating. So as I saw this unfold, this history in the 19th century, as I saw the way that lynch mobs at the end of the 19th century would use ideas of Black incivility to punish and mutilate Black bodies, when I saw that various coups d'etats, 1898, Wilmington, a mob of 2,000, stormed the Black part of the city and destroyed the printing press, destroyed all the businesses. The Black residents were fleeing for their lives. The governor at the time said this was done in the name of civility, to preserve order, to protect the peace. As I saw all this, I came to recognize this distinct pattern. And then I wondered, why is it that so many folks continue to turn to civility? And why are those movements like the Democratic Party today that claim to speak for racial justice, why do they believe that it's such an effective tactic? And so I recognized on some level that the way to answer this question had to be historically as well. Have anti-racist movements used civility when they were waging their struggle? Abolitionists, civil rights activists, various citizens who are arguing for reforms to prison and policing. Do they use civility? And what became clear was that they don't. From Frederick Douglass to Ida B. Wells, the famous anti-lynching crusader, to Martin Luther King, who famously in 1963, as he's imprisoned in Birmingham for being too uncivil, he writes a letter to 8 clergymen saying that Black people cannot wait. Black people cannot wait and be patient and be civil. They need to engage in direct action. They need to engage in confrontational activity. It, of course, is nonviolent. And I'll explain the distinction between civility and nonviolence in a second. But what is clear about King's message is that he believes the only way to counteract Jim Crow is through disruptive action, the march, the boycott. And if it means breaking unjust laws, that's okay. It might be necessary. So when I saw the way that all of the most famous and important anti-racists were involved in pushing against civility, I wondered, again, does that mean that they endorse violence? And I too came away with a very clear understanding. The answer is decisively no. Most successful anti-racist movements enacted by the greatest anti-racists in American history are not waged in the name of violence. There are some exceptions. John Brown comes to mind. But generally speaking, it is precisely through disruptive, organized activity, bringing people together. However, that disruptive activity is driven by a commitment to justice, not civility. That disruptive activity is driven by an understanding that the most important thing is not to reach across the aisle to the racist, to the white supremacist, to the moderate who is more invested in the status quo rather than transformative change. In fact, you might be surprised that King in that same letter, 1963 letter from Birmingham jail, says the greatest threat to the Black freedom struggle is not the Klansmen, it's the white moderate. And King says that because he understands that his goal is not to appeal to folks who see him as an enemy. It's not to reach across the aisle. It is to create a loving coalition of supporters who agree with the idea that Black people are deserving of dignity. So he aligns himself with various folks, those who are pacifists like Quakers, those who are invested in women's equality, in gay people's equality, in economic equality. And so by the time that King is in his last year of life, he's organizing the Poor People's Campaign, the Poor People's Movement. And on the day of his assassination, he is organizing Black sanitation workers in Memphis to argue for not only an end to racism and discrimination, but also support of economic equality. And so when I saw the way that so many anti-racists were concerned with breaking free from civility, but not to endorse violence, to endorse what I call civic radicalism, which is the desire to reconstitute society and build coalitions around principles of justice, dignity, and freedom, rather than reaching across the aisle. I, again, became really interested and curious why we are seeing the Democratic Party again embrace civility in the figure of Joe Biden. But then it also became clear to me that rather than looking at the folks who are in power, who are in Congress, who's president, it's also important to ask what is happening on the ground. And I wrote the book before the George Floyd protests in 2020. And it became clear to me that I perhaps misunderstood what was happening before our eyes today. I thought that the real question of where we are in American history had to do in part with who's president. Is it Trump or Biden? But as I saw the Floyd protests taking shape, I recognized that these folks were part of the same traditions, were part of the same history that begins with the anti-slavery movement and the Underground Railroad, that extends to the anti-lynching movement, to the Black labor movement, to the various civil rights protests of the 1960s, and the attempts to challenge mass incarceration and police brutality today. So I recognized that these folks on the ground are beginning a new phase, a new era in American history that we maybe saw glimmers of in 2012 after the murder of Trayvon Martin and the rise of the hashtag Black Lives Matter by 3 Black queer feminists. But it became apparent to me that 2020 and the protests, the racial justice protests of this past year, were the beginning of hopefully a better future. Okay. So that's my introduction. I'll be happy to continue the conversation in whatever way works, field any questions, and I can answer anything in particular that you feel could be expanded upon.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'll just repeat, please add any of your questions into the Q&A at any point. I have a few questions and then we will get to yours. So my first is that when I first saw the cover of your book, I thought it was about manners. Earlier this year, we had Debbie Irving speak at the library, and she wrote Waking Up White and Finding Myself in the Story of Race. She's from a similar community to Wayland and talked about coming to the realization that she is a white person with certain privileges and powers. And also the part that really struck me was she described white culture, which I'd never heard of and I assumed didn't exist. But some of the things that she lists as part of white culture are sprinkled throughout your book. So I just want to list a few of them and see if you could riff off that. Sure. So the first is politeness, conflict avoidance, defensiveness, Black and white thinking, either or. And then there's also power hoarding, paternalism, exceptionalism, and objectivity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that on some level, this is spot on. And I think part of what I'm trying to tell in this book is that our very understanding of what counts as good personal and political etiquette is not only racialized, which is to say, it has a deep history that exists from the beginning, but also that it is a history and it's constructed, that nothing about whether shouting is okay when you are trying to remember the legacy of a young boy, Emmett Till, who's murdered by two white supremacists in Money, Mississippi. There's nothing inherent about the idea that you can't shout or grieve or be impolite when that is something you experience, or when a black man, unarmed black man, is suffocated by a police officer in 2020. However, in a society that privileges a certain understanding of race, a certain understanding of identity, it becomes common sense that certain people are allowed to say certain things and other people are not. To give you an example, you think about the way that Barack Obama, our first black president, tried to be incredibly careful about not appearing too angry, being cool and composed. And even though he did that, just like Booker T. Washington did the same thing at the end of the 19th century, he couldn't escape the fact that he existed in a racist society. And so there were members of the opposition, specifically Tea Partiers, who, regardless of what he did, would say, "You weren't born here. You're a radical socialist. You are angry inside. You're just hiding it. You're a threat." There was a famous image of him being painted in whiteface as a Joker. So all of this was happening. And then 8 years later, a man who runs on a white nationalist platform is seen as maybe a little bit iconoclastic, maybe a little bit too rough, maybe a little bit too intense. But ultimately, that's something that is not so definitively seen as part of who he is, in the same way as Barack Obama always has to circumvent the racial decorum and racial dynamics. And this is just one example to stress the way that if you're a black citizen living in a society that has a racialized history, it's very hard to operate in a condition of freely choosing how to behave. Because whether you like it or not, you want to wear a hoodie, that means that you're a target. You want to walk in a white neighborhood and barbecue in Oakland, go into a Starbucks in Philadelphia in 2018, you could be policed because there's a history. This is where I talk about the history of race that assigns a certain value to what white people do and another value to what non-white people do. Now, again, I don't want anyone to mistake the basic difference, which is it's true that in a racialized society, power matters. And where you are in that society affects the likelihood of how you'll be perceived and discriminated. That doesn't mean that there are some people who can't at times escape it for fortune, luck, whatever, but still, as an empirical historical reality, that's what it means to live in a racialized society. So this is kind of a long-winded way of saying part of what I'm trying to suggest here is that civility itself has a racial history or racial undertones, and that it can never be disconnected from that in America.
So on that note, I wanted to go to some of your examples of civility enforcing racism and racist ideas. And throughout your book, which I highly recommend everyone take out from the library or purchase, I found myself like going back and forth between time periods, things repeating themselves, like you just referenced Booker T and Obama. So one part that was fascinating was starting with Calhoun, but the whole project of recasting slavery after the Civil War as something good and repealing Reconstruction. And I felt like you echoed that later in the 1990s when they're dismantling welfare programs.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
could you just expand on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing that, I'd urge everyone to think about when they think about American history is not a steady progress, but a zigzag, a back and forth, especially when it comes to race in America. Because as I've already described, the aftermath of the Civil War seems like this utopian possibility. There's the establishment of the Freedmen's Bureau, which promises, or at least in theory, suggests that Black people can have 40 acres and a mule. This is the first major discussion of reparations in America. There's talk of serious programs to uplift formerly enslaved people. But at the same time, there's a vicious, vicious response immediately from the sitting president, who takes power right after Abraham Lincoln is assassinated. And that, of course, is the Democrat Andrew Johnson. And what you see immediately after the Civil War is the consolidation of racial violence. The first Klan, the Ku Klux Klan, is formed in 1866, not even a year after the end of the Civil War. And immediately there's pushback. So by the time you get to 1877, which is when Reconstruction formally ends, you've already seen 12 years of massive white resistance. And what's crucial to understand is that all of that resistance is again being framed through civility. On the one hand, you have the white supremacists who start to endorse the idea of lynching. And they come up with a distorted myth that says they are simply protecting the honor of white women. They are simply trying to be chivalrous. It's remarkable. If you look at any photo of the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, or a lynching photo in the 1890s, you will see that white people with men, women, and children are smiling at the camera as Black bodies are hanging lifeless. And it's because they see themselves as being civil. So this is the kind of white supremacist response. But on the other hand, there is the Republican response. At the time, Republicans are the party of abolition, at least in theory. Figures like Ulysses S. Grant. And they just want peace. They believe that their goal is to unify the nation. So they continue time and time again to say, look, the Civil War is done. It's behind us. Let's move on. Let's have a brighter day. Now, this might seem like an appealing project, but what happens when there's vigilante violence at night? What happens when there are distinct acts of violence against Black citizens as they're trying to vote? What happens by the 1890s, as you know, when you get the poll tax, when you get the grandfather clause, when you get all of these Jim Crow legislation? So what ends up happening during the post-Reconstruction era is a reconsolidation of racism and white supremacy in the name of civility. And so to go back to your point, Courtney, about the 1990s, there's a similar trend. What happens in the 1990s is that the Democratic Party, looking at the past 30 years of Republican victories, from Richard Nixon in 1968 to Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, believes that the only way it can maintain relevance is by appealing to the notion of bipartisanship, moving past the problems and gains of the civil rights movement. So it's not surprising that the Democratic Party nominates a figure, Bill Clinton, who is the governor not of New York, but of Arkansas, a southern state. And it's Bill Clinton who, as he's about to run for election, 92, goes to Arkansas to personally oversee the execution of an illiterate Black man, Ricky Ray Rector, who, as he is being executed, says, "I'll save my dessert for later." This is something that Bill Clinton sees as valuable for gaining bipartisan credentials. And in 1994, Clinton signs the Violent Crime Control Act, which is meant to increase policing, is meant to expand the fencing on the border. In 96, he's proud to end welfare as we know it, with the aid of a Republican Congress that is led by Newt Gingrich. And so, to me, there's a striking parallel in the 1990s just like there was in the 1870s when the party of racial justice was retreating. And I would even make a further argument, which is today there are deep echoes of the way various conservative movements in the 1880s and 1890s tried to restrict the right to vote. That's what you're seeing in all of these states today. In Georgia, for instance, the desire to repeal various laws that make voting more accessible. Not surprisingly, the very moment when participation was at a record high. In 1868, Black participation in many southern states was 95%. By the 1890s, it was at 3%. And that came not because Black people were uninterested in participating in the franchise. It came because there was a targeted and strategic, surgical even, strategy by the right to restrict the franchise.
Thank you. So we've just talked about civility, enforcing racism, and I wanted to go the other way. Can you talk about some of the examples of civic radicals? What are the characteristics of civic radicals? A couple times you talk about the evolution of their thinking, their tactics, and then finally, this is a big question, their legacy, for example, the sanitation of Martin Luther King.
Right, right. So here's what I'll say. I think that civic radicalism I use as a kind of general shorthand to illustrate that it's possible to forge a politics that is not civil, but also that is nonviolent. Or to put it differently, it's possible to forge a politics that is disruptive, transformative, collective, but also something that all Americans can get behind. And what you see time and time again is that for all of these anti-racists that I chronicle in the book, so the first chapter is roughly a biography of Frederick Douglass and all of the movements and figures he's associated with. The second is W.B. Du Bois, James Baldwin, Angela Davis, Audre Lorde, so on. What you see consistently is even those who try to reach across the aisle. Frederick Douglass, for instance, after he becomes the most famous orator in America, continues to push William Lloyd Garrison's pacifist position, continues to say that the way to abolish slavery is through what Garrison calls moral suasion, moral persuasion. But by the 1850s, after Douglass witnesses the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, which for all intents and purposes nationalizes slavery because it allows for fugitive slave catchers to roam across the Mason-Dixon line, Douglass begins to see that the only way possible is through collective action, and it might need war or it might need some force. And as a matter of fact, that's what ends up happening. You know, slavery is toppled through collective action, what W.B. Du Bois calls a general strike by enslaved people, when Black people refuse to work and join the union, join the fight against slavery. And so you look at someone like Douglass, you look at someone like Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells watches her Memphis office, where she's writing scathing editorials condemning lynching, burn, because white supremacists do not tolerate a Black woman who's unapologetic arguing against the injustice that she sees in front of her. But what does Ida Wells do as an example of civic radicalism? Well, for starters, long before Rosa Parks, she refuses to get in the back of a segregated streetcar. And this gives her a certain level of fame and notoriety. Later, she takes her anti-lynching crusade to the UK. In the 19-teens and 1920s, she gets involved in various community organizations in Chicago where she moves. And at some point, she actually runs for the Illinois state legislature. So there are so many different ways in which the civic radical can engage in a transformative politics. And the best example, perhaps, is Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King begins his life deeply committed to an ethic of nonviolence, and that doesn't change. And at the beginning, King himself is invested in a very strategic focus on segregation in the South, Montgomery, Mississippi, and so on. But by the 1960s, he soon recognizes that there's only so much that the status quo will allow. If you think about it, the Montgomery bus boycott lasts for 381 days. There, between 1955, when it starts, and 1964, that's 9 years, you have various examples of activism. The Greensboro sit-in, the March on Washington, and all of these other activities. 9 years later, not 1 year later, 2 years later, 9 years later, you get the first major piece of civil rights legislation, which is the Civil Rights Act. And then in 1965, the Voting Rights Act. So King sees this and he thinks, we've been struggling for 9 years, trying to focus on something so limited, like repealing the grandfather clause, making non-discrimination as crystallized in the 14th Amendment a right. And this is how far we've gotten. So King, after he sees this, recognizes that he has to expand his struggle. So he no longer is only concerned with Black Southerners. He starts to live in Chicago, where when he moves into the west side of Chicago, he's struck by the way asbestos is falling from the ceiling, and there are rats the size of cats. And so King advocates for residents of this neighborhood to engage in rent strikes, to refuse to pay rent. He gets folks involved at the football stadium, Soldier Field, in order to rally Black and Puerto Rican citizens to take seriously their economic equality. So King begins to broaden his understanding of what racial justice means, because he recognizes, as every anti-racist does throughout their lives, that a small slice of the focus is only going to get a very tinier, an even tinier response from those in power.
And can you talk a little bit about how he's taught now?
Yes.
Legacy.
Yeah. So it's actually quite remarkable. In the 1960s, King is called by the director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, a liar, a criminal, one of the most violent Americans in the United States. In the 1960s, although King's approval rating is quite high among Black Americans, it's dismal among white Americans, even in the 1960s. I mean, some of these numbers are 30%, 35% King's approval rating. So what happens? What happens is that it becomes clear that in the 1980s, because King is such a charismatic, powerful, transformative figure, that it would be incredibly advantageous for conservative forces to use him or remake him in the image that served their interests. So of course, you could find King talking about judging people by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. But if you read I Have a Dream, as he says this, right next to it, he says, we need to end police brutality. We need to abolish incarceration of Black youth. But it becomes advantageous to take a hero, to take a transformative thinker and whitewash him and to make him serve your narrative. So that's what ends up happening. And it's quite striking because even still, there's massive opposition, especially from the South. Strom Thurmond, for instance, the senator, is adamant about not having King be memorialized through a federal holiday. And it's because he, in a certain way, remembers King's anti-war stance against Vietnam. And he says that we should not have an anti-American, anti-war agitator who was arguing for integration be memorialized every January. And that struggle in the 1980s takes 6 years. It's not until 1986 when there is a formalized holiday. And so I think that what you see consistently, King is just the best example of this, is the attempt by conservative forces to take the best and brightest figures of anti-racism and try to make them much more palatable for a conservative agenda. I mean, it's absolutely stunning that a couple of years ago, Mike Pence, during one of these MLK days, said that King would certainly accept the policing of the border, that King was all about restricting immigration because he believed that it was important to protect the country. And so you could see how taking a hero and making them one of your own is never about really memorializing that person's legacy in all its complexity. And I mean in all its complexity. There are certain things, that we need to remember about King, how, for instance, in 1963, he specifically did not want James Baldwin there because James Baldwin was gay and he thought that this would be a detriment to the movement. Or, his attitude towards women, his personal attitudes towards his wife, But at the same time, it's striking how his legacy and image has been co-opted to simply fuel the idea of color blindness or fuel the idea that the only thing that we must do to achieve racial equality is to treat everyone without any regard for history, treat everyone without any regard for specific structures that inform how society is organized, and that is the end and beginning of King's legacy. It's not surprising, but it's remarkable the success at which conservative forces have had in using King as an image.
Thank you. Let's see. I just want to add a little personal anecdote. When I was thinking about that question, I remember reading the autobiography of Malcolm X in high school, and an uncle sort of going, "Why are you reading that? He was a racist against whites and crazy," and sort of, and so also using Malcolm X's legacy against MLK's and sort of the generational shifts of how they each view these personalities. I just find fascinating.
Yeah.
So my next question, and so this is my last, and then we'll go to everyone else's questions, is about January 6th and Joe Biden's inaugural speech. So if you could talk about what you were thinking, seeing these white people attacking the Capitol, attacking the police,
right.
And then hearing Joe Biden talking about unity and reaching across.
I think that it's kind of remarkable, as you kind of alluded to, the repetition of history. I mean, I couldn't have imagined that we would have had January 6th and Joe Biden's inaugural address sound the way that it did. But at the same time, if I had read my own book, or if I had actually gone back to history, I think it wouldn't have been surprising at all. When I saw January 6th, what I was reminded of was various vigilantes and mobs that would take spaces, black, white, whatever, because they deemed themselves civil. To me, what's striking is that the rioters are seeing themselves as civil. It's their country. They're simply taking their country back. They are simply restoring order. The 2020 election was a hoax. It was a fraud. This repetition of history in which some white people see themselves as the only ones who can decide what is proper, what is polite, what is normal, what is acceptable. To me, it is a textbook example of a legacy of racism in which not simply Black voices and Black people are demeaned, because you just have to look at the summer to see how heavily policed the Capitol was during the Black Lives Matter protests. And there wasn't violence at all. But at the same time, January 6th speaks to this legacy where certain white people see themselves as the bastions of the public good, and that they don't even need to consult with the democratic process. They don't need to know what the Electoral College said in 2020. They know who their president is, just like they knew that Barack Obama was not born here, right? Now, this is, of course, not a fact. This is a lie. Still, when you're dealing with something as slippery as civility, it makes perfect sense. On the other hand, I see Biden as repeating a similar legacy of the post-Reconstruction era, when Republicans like Ulysses S. Grant thought that the best way to maintain national prominence was to peel off as many moderate whites as possible into their coalition. Because the idea behind Ulysses S. Grant's plea for unity was that he was hopeful that he would be able to get moderate Republicans in the North, that he would be able to shave off some Democrats in the South to vote for him. Biden, at least based on the inaugural speech, has a similar strategy in mind. He wants to focus on this mythical block of suburban whites who are the bedrock of the coalition. And so the bipartisanship is as much about personal feeling and commitment. Look, I mean, he may really feel this, and he seems like a very empathetic and kind and generous person, right? But at the same time, the political messaging and the political strategy is very much to appeal to a specific block of suburban white people who are seen as gettable for the Democratic Party. And I think that on some level, you can argue, again, you never know, you can argue that this is potentially a mistake, because the alternative strategy is to energize young people, is to energize Black and brown people, is to energize poor people. It's to energize folks who care about the environment. And although Biden is trying to, with his policy, walk a tight rope between the two, it's clear that there are two choices. And my argument in the book, or maybe to put it differently, based on my interpretation of history, it's not even my argument, it's my reading of history, it's more effective to build coalitions of the willing rather than try to waste time and precious resources reaching across the aisle to folks who may never be interested in what you have to say. So.
Thank you. Let me just look quickly through. We have a few questions. This is a general one. If incivility is pushing back against injustice, who gets to determine what is just?
I think, let me just, I'm a professor, so I definitions, I want to be, clear about something. To me, incivility and civility, these things, it's a false division. Incivility signifies, on some level, at least culturally, some massive disruption. That's why I prefer to use civic radicalism. To me, you can determine justice based in several things. You can determine it based in some kind of natural law. This is the kind of Enlightenment tradition. You can determine justice based on a directly democratic process. This, of course, was a conundrum that King was faced with in the 1960s, when he knew that he needed to find an alternative to Jim Crow authoritarianism, which was legal. So he needed to find a language. He called it justice. But King used justice, as he understood it, through the idea of universal humanity. And all of these civic radicals use universal humanity. Just because you don't subscribe to the dichotomy between civil and uncivil doesn't mean that you don't take everyone's humanity seriously, including the white supremacists or the Klansmen. The difference, however, is that your politics will not be driven by appealing to those who would rather extinguish you or exterminate you or silence you. And I think that that is the crucial issue here, less about what happens if incivility is too vague, and more what happens when we reframe our understanding of action away from civility and civility and toward justice that believes seriously in universal humanity, but does not see reaching across the aisle to the most detrimental, disruptive, violent aspects of society as the way forward.
Okay. I'm going to go with another question along the definition line. So Karen was appreciating your definition of civic radicalism and asking if you coined the phrase.
Yes.
Her question is, if a person is committed to reconstituting society around principles of justice, dignity, and freedom, are they a civic radical? Is that different from an anti-racist?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question. I mean, I really wanted to use the term civic radicalism to stress something broader, which is to say, part of the goal of the book is to use the experience of anti-racist struggle to shed light on other movements, to shed light on the women's struggle, to shed light on the LGBTQ struggle, to shed light on the struggle against poverty, against war. And so I think that part of what I'm trying to do is say, yes, civic radicalism is the best form of anti-racism. At the same time, civic radicalism goes beyond anti-racism in the sense that it's applicable for all other movements. It's applicable for the youth who are inspired by Greta Thunberg, who want to deal with climate change and global warming, just like it's useful for these Amazon workers in Bessemer who were trying to get, unionized. So all of these tactics extend beyond race, but I think you're right that it is central and integral to the most successful anti-racist movements throughout history.
Great. All right, I'll just read this question. When the club of civility is wielded to shut down the race conversation or contain it to a safe space, there's an implied rule that it's not civil to express emotion. But it's really that real emotion is threatening. It demands work be done to change the status quo. How do you feel about the necessity of acknowledging that race is an intrinsically emotional issue? And how might we go about allowing and even embracing the expression of emotion in the discourse on race and coming to grips with the whole spectrum of what it really is to be civil as human beings?
That is an excellent, thoughtful, very beautifully worded question. I mean, thank you for that question. I think that what I would say is that as a civic radical or as an anti-racist, you're always trying to balance your commitment to equality, dignity, freedom, as you're putting, even universal respect, with an understanding that in politics, you have to create coalitions. You have to make strategic decisions. And so one of the things that I really try to stress here in the book is that there's a difference between trying to think about civility only in the everyday sphere, in the interpersonal sphere, and thinking about civility as a political tool, as a tool for organizing. And my argument is that we can have a debate about whether civility is still worth reclaiming or defending at the dinner table, at school, and there's good arguments to be made that when it comes to those spaces, there may be more value for civility in these interpersonal spaces. What I'm trying to get readers to appreciate is when it comes to politics, politics is not everyday life. Politics is about interests. It's about structures. It's about history. It's about parties. And so I think one of the great misunderstandings, I would argue a confusion, is to conflate politics, which is about how do you organize a society? How do you create justice in the political sense, as opposed to the interpersonal interactions that we're most familiar with. And I think that it's important to distinguish the two and to say that you can have dignity being your primary vision, your animating impulse, and equality and respect in everyday life. And when it comes to politics, you can have that as well. However, when civility becomes the motivating principle in politics, it means, quite frankly, that the status quo is maintained as brutally as before, that injustices and inequities are maintained as brutally as before, because when you are having a conversation with someone at the dinner table, you may or may not persuade them. But if you make civility into a political platform, it means that the opposing side will always have a seat at the table, and it means that their position must always be honored. So if the neo-Nazi If the Charlottesville protester, if the racist wants to join in and say, I don't even believe in racism, it's not real. It's a conspiracy. It's a conspiracy, it's fake news. When you use civility as a political platform, you can't just reject this view. You have to engage it. And that becomes detrimental to the movement. So I think that it's a hard line to walk, but I think analytically and historically, it's an important clarification that citizens ought to have about the differences between civility in politics and civility in everyday life.
I think I'm going to end with one more question from Alyssa. She asks, and this is related, what are your recommendations for dismantling white culture in groups and organizations? Practical steps whites can take, how to communicate with someone who believes that only people of color can speak to whites of their concerns.
I think it's an incredibly hard and fraught question. And, like as a historian and a political scientist, I'm always kind of looking for historical patterns, And also, one of the things that I try to do as a white scholar is think about what it means to write about these questions and issues and to think about these questions intentionally. And so when I decided to take up this project, as all of my projects, my focus was simply, what do the voices who have experienced this history, this reality most thoroughly, most intensely, what do they have to say? That doesn't mean that as a white person, I may not have a perspective or position, but it does mean that my first line of orientation and thought is to inquire into how people of color have thought about combating racism. And I think that for many people, that is a difficult, many white people, that is a difficult starting point, And so I urge all my students, Black and white, to read Black literature, to read Black history, to read these voices who have actually experienced these dilemmas and problems and have found courageous and heroic ways to address them. And so I think that on the first kind of order of practical advice and evidence is, for white citizens to acknowledge a certain level of humility and try to look when they can to the Black experience, the Black standpoint, Black history. I think about it often. I teach Black studies courses at my university, and I'm surprised at how many of my students think that Black history is just not for them, that it's only for Black students. And when they come to class and they recognize that Black history actually is American history, and it has so many tools and rich resources for thinking about the future and the present. So rather than ask, what does Thomas Jefferson say about democracy? What does Frederick Douglass? What does W.B. Du Bois? And too often that's missing from our conversation, from our national consciousness. So on the kind of, as a professor and academic, I would say that the first kind of practical piece of evidence is to look to Black voices and Black citizens and Black experience to enrich your understanding as a white person. This is how I was able to think so much more critically about these issues. On the other hand, I guess I'll say that I think it's really important to simply understand power from a historical and structural perspective. And I think that this is absolutely crucial. History, as James Baldwin put it, is in everything that we do. And as much as we may want to shake it off, it's important to acknowledge its presence and how it surrounds us and how to grapple with it. And so I think that sensibility, knowing that we're not ever in a unique place, that the January 6th riot was on some level not new, even though the media may have portrayed it as unprecedented, that Donald Trump's presidency was not new by historical standards. At the same time, the various protests, the various concern with race and anti-racism we're seeing today with young people in particular, that's not new either. That in many ways is a throwback to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee of the 1960s. It's a throwback to the young Black feminists who were organizing in the 1890s. So you're seeing the repetition of history. And the one kind of practical piece of advice I'd say is always be mindful and thoughtful of the way that history shapes the present and how we live in its shadow, and to always understand that there are choices to be made at any given moment.
Thank you. I think that's a good note to end on. I want to thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for your book, and thank everyone for their awesome questions.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Courtney. Thank you to the community. I'm so delighted you took time out of your day and were able to be part of this discussion. So thank you so much. I'm really grateful.
Thank you. I just want to put in one plug for our next event. Let me see if I can bring it up on the screen. Let's see. There we go. Our next event is April 22nd. It is a panel discussion co-sponsored by First Parish in Wayland on race, monuments, and memory. Are we confronting injustice or tearing down history? So this should be a good one. You can register at tinyurl.com/monuments and memory. And with that, I will say to everyone, have a great afternoon, and thank you again, Alex.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon. Take care.
You too.